All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Mark Raymer Yurtzeit Shir for this year. Just before we get started, to Naomi and to Adi, thank you for giving me this opportunity for us to come together. The Yurtzeit was today, and it is, I guess, a short 6 years ago that I met Mark for the first time. We were discussing a short visit I was making to Atlantic Beach, which he had intended would become longer, and ultimately came to pass. And as he was an architect with a plan for my coming out to Atlantic Beach, and so I thank him in absentia and his family for continuing to support all the great things here at JCAB. We have, I guess, a double header of special shiurim tonight and Rabbi Lefkowitz with Rabbi Krohn tomorrow night. So everyone should zoom in for that as well, the usual shiur link. But tonight, in advance of Pesach, we're going to cover a topic that is close to any child's heart, stealing the Afikoman. Stealing the Afikoman is, we're going to discuss a little bit the rite of passage. I think if this works, in the chat is a link to the sources that we're going to be using. And we're going to cover just the idea of the Afikoman. When you hear the word Afikoman, you think, what do you think of? It's a piece of matzah. It's at the end of the Seder. Sometimes some people here you might not make it to the end, right? So it's, I still remember for many years, our family participated and led a community Seder. 1 year we had 230 people. It was a little insane. It happened to me, there was someone got married Sunday and Pesach was Monday night. So they made the Seder one of the Sheva brachos and the families were all from overseas, and so they all came to the Seder. Let's just say, by the time we served the meal, once the main course was served, everyone headed for the door. That was just the reality. But the Afikoman is unique for a number of different ways. So we're going to talk a little bit about the custom. What is it? What happens to it? And maybe, like much of the Seder, there's a lot of symbolism in the Seder. When we've spoken before, the idea of the Seder has a lot of symbolism, and it talks about freedom, and it talks about redemption, and it talks about celebration, and there's bitterness and saltiness and all these different emotions that are being represented with symbols. Even the matzah itself we've spoken about. The matzah represents slavery, the bread of affliction, but it's also the bread of freedom, because that's what they ate, because the dough couldn't rise, because they were too rushed. So I think we're going to see that Afikoman has a lot of symbolic meaning. The Afikoman appears in the Mishnah in Psachim in the last chapter with an expression which we know from the Haggadah, Ein maftirin achar Pesach Afikoman, which translates, they may not conclude with Afikoman after the Pesach. Right? The Pesach Seder used to, the main ingredient, the main food of the Pesach Seder, the Passover Seder, we no longer have. What was it? What did they eat at the Passover Seder? The lamb, the Karban Pesach. They ate the Paschal lamb. I always like to point out, every year, there's always a politically motivated Israeli who takes a little lamb and goes up to the Temple Mount entrance and tries to get it in so he can bring the Paschal offering. He gets arrested, he pays a fine, he comes back next year. But we no longer have the Paschal lamb. In many communities, the custom developed not to eat lamb at the Seder night, even as a cooked meal. Some don't eat anything roasted. I remember growing up, there was a boiled chicken and boiled flunkin that was on the menu. There's a whole discussion in Shulchan Aruch in the Code of Jewish Law as to what's the definition of roasted. Let's say you roast it with a little bit of liquid. Is that enough to be considered not roasted, right? Rabbi, what do you serve at the Seder? What's the main course? I don't know. What do they serve at your Seder? Yeah.
We serve piece of chicken.
Yeah, it's usually, I still remember, I sometimes felt a little bit underwhelmed. It's boiled, boiled flunkin is not that, exotic looking. So we have, but the Mishnah says you couldn't end the Seder with the Afikoman. So what does it mean you can't conclude with the Afikoman? We're thinking that you end the Seder with the Afikoman. So Afikoman is not a Hebrew word. Afikoman seems to be based on a Greek word. Professor Saul Lieberman, professor of Talmud at JTS, a very learned individual who corresponded with many great rabbis about about some of the words in the Talmud, about the history of the Talmud. He has a summary of his opinion. Source number 2, the rabbis were familiar with the Greek customs and their banquet manners, that when the festivities would reach their peak, they would burst into others' homes to force them to join in the continuing party. And they would call this the Afikoman. The Mishnah warns that one does not conclude the Passover with this type of experience, and this is the interpretation of the Babylonian and Eretz Yisraeli Talmud. What does it mean they don't end with the Afikoman? And this is something that the Talmud in Jewish law talks about. You're supposed to end the Seder where you began the Seder. You're supposed to end it at the table. But there seemed to be this excitement as you get towards the end that people want to go to other people's houses. And the Gemara in Jewish law talks about, what if you go to someone else's house? Do you say the grace after meals there? Do you bench there if you ate somewhere else? So Professor Lieberman says what they want to point out, that you should end the Seder where you began the Seder. All of the Seder should be in one place. And then, but it's based on this experience that historically and sociologically existed of Afikoman or Epikomazen, in terms of moving from place to place. And the Mishnah says that's not what you want to end the meal with. By going somewhere else, you want to end the meal where it ends. And how does the Seder meal end? So the Gemara and the Mishnah, the Talmud Jewish tradition tells us it ends with matzah and it ends with 4 cups of wine. So that's what the Mishnah has to say. When the Gemara starts trying to say, so okay, what about what we colloquially call Afikoman? So what is it? The Gemara asked the question, Psachim 119b, source 3. What is Afikoman? Rav said they must not get up and move from one eating group to another. Right? That's what the Talmud actually says, similar in line with what Professor Lieberman identified as a Greek phenomenon. Shmuel said, like mushrooms for me and pigeons for Rabbi Abba. Right? I guess Shmuel is describing certain delicacies, that if you have a meal, what might you want as a little dessert? There was a little extra course. So Shmuel liked mushrooms and Abba liked pigeon. I guess, quail or something like that. Some people very much, what do you want for dessert after eating a lot of meat? More meat. Okay. And then Chanina Bar Shaila said, Rabbi Yochanan, dates, parched grain, and nuts. Sweets. Dessert. So the Afikoman has developed into something that we call it the dessert, right? Always at our Seder. My father made the line. I make the line that, oh, wow, we're having matzah for dessert. I'd rather have a nice piece of cake or some compote or something like that. But we see that the Afikoman is what's coming after. It could be a type of food coming after, or it could be recognizing that you shouldn't get up and leave at the end. You have to finish the Seder where you're experiencing it. So that's the historical, that's what the Afikoman is. It's a word that comes from the outside that describes how we should either be behaving or what we should be eating what's happening at this point towards the end of the meal. So in terms of how it actually developed, in terms of nowadays, how many matzahs do most of us use at the Seder table? 3. Some use 2. So, and we all are familiar. At the beginning of the Seder, we break a matzah, and so the Sefer Rokeach. So you're going back into medieval Ashkenaz Jewry. Source 4: take 1 matzah and break it into 2 pieces, since the practice of a poor person is to eat a piece and place another piece under the napkin. And this keeps with the verse, they wrapped it in their cloaks upon their shoulders. And when the Jews left, they put the dough on their shoulder. So there's this idea that we're familiar with. We break it, we save it for later, we put it aside. So this whole idea of putting aside becomes part and parcel of the practice of the Pesach Seder. Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, source 5. You take ve'yikach matzah emtsoyis v'yitzenu l'shnayim. You take the middle matzah, right? The symbolism of the 3 matzahs, Kohen, Levi, Israel, different significance. You break the middle one. V'yitein chatzia le'achar ha'mehabesubin l'shomra le'afikomen. You give it to someone there to hold on to it for the Afikomen. V'nosinosa tachas hamapa. You put it inside a cover. You're thinking Afikoman bags. Who here has an Afikoman bag made for them by their children or grandchildren? We'll always whip out the ones that my 24-year-old made when she was in 1st grade. It's even better when there's some little crumbs left. V'chatzia hasheni yasim ben shtei hashlemos. You put the other one back on the Seder table. Right? So there is this idea that you have this piece of matzah, and the matzah is supposed to be watched, and it's supposed to be in a bag or a cover, and you hold it for later. So Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch, in source number 6, Rabbi Moshe Sternbuch is a contemporary rabbi in Israel today. He was a rabbi in South Africa, moved to Israel, rabbi of the Haredi community in Israel. And he talks about that this actually is a reenactment of something that the Afikoman symbolizes. He says that, remember, that the Afikoman actually symbolizes the Paschal Lamb, because the Paschal Lamb was not the main course. The Paschal Lamb was everyone had a little piece. So, getting back to the Gemara Psachim, where the person would have some pigeon, right? The Paschal Lamb was like this little piece of meat at the end of the meal. And so the Seder is going on, Rabbi Sternbuch says, and he's quoting Reb Chaim Brisker, that it really commemorates the Paschal Lamb. The Paschal Lamb is a sanctified, sacred object from the Holy Temple. It's a sacrifice. You have to treat it with respect. You have to guard it to make sure nothing happens to it that's inappropriate. You have to make sure it doesn't become impure. You have to protect it like you should protect a holy object. So if our Afikoman, our matzah, we are supposed to imagine as if it's the Paschal Lamb, we should treat the matzah the way we treat the Paschal Lamb, and we should guard it, we should protect it, and we should cover it, we should keep it safe. And he goes on to say that that's why it's not appropriate at the end that you give it, that Yeladim chotfin umatmin in Afikoman, that you let the kids steal it. Because you don't let the kids take care of the important stuff. And he says, instead, what should you do with it to take care of it? He says, last line, source 6, Nir lefi niyazdati shetov linhog sheha'ima. Let the mother take charge of it. Because if you want something done right, Naomi, who do you give it to? You make sure the mother takes it. You don't trust the father, Abby, sorry. Right? That you let them, or someone else who knows, Kozman, Hechanim, so you have to know someone who knows exactly where it is the whole time. So this whole idea of hiding has a kind of religious origin, but it's a religious origin that we're treating the matzah as if it was the Paschal Lamb, and we're going to treat it the way we treat holy objects.
Some of the father, I think, because you don't want to know where it is. He wants to ask for something. So if the father knows where it is, he just goes and takes it.
Okay, so now we have to talk a little bit about this whole idea in terms of what's happening, with where is it and who takes it. This idea, how do the kids get involved in it? So, obviously the Seder is very much about the children, the 4 sons, and you have, it's about the children. So the Talmud describes about, in terms of involving the children, it's the top of the second page, Psachim 109a. They said about Rabbi Akiva that he would distribute roasted grains and nuts to children on Passover Eve so they would not sleep and so they would ask. Right? You want kids to ask questions. Technically, tonight I say this, by the way, I once gave a class, so this is kind of the origin of all the Passover candy. Like the chocolate lollipops, or especially the fruit slices. You had to have some candy at the table. Then it was taught that Rabbi Eliezer said one grabs the matzos and one should eat them very quickly on account of the children so that they won't fall asleep and they're going to ask about the practice. You're supposed to grab the matzah. You're supposed to take it. You're supposed to snatch it. So this is all about the children asking questions. So you're snatching matzah for the children, snatching matzah for the children. Children snatch the matzah. It kind of developed that if we're doing all this stuff for the kids, hey, let's let the kids snatch the matzah. And so source number 7, Siach Yitzchak in the 16th century, that kol shinuyim sheyuchol la'aseh k'dei sheshalu hatinokos yaseh. You should do any question possible. Anything that possibly so the children will ask. For example, lachtof mashe biyado. Hey, grab it. Grab what's in my hand. V'yignovu afikoman. Let him steal the afikoman. V'chozrin. And we can return it. V'chot that Kadosh Baruch Hu misavel lazeh. Right? This is something Hashem wants the kids involved. Give them something to do. Give them a challenge. Try to steal it. Some people hide it and ask the kids to seek it. It's all part of engaging the children. It's so they'll ask a question. I saw, one of my, may talk about this before Pesach on Shabbos, before the Seder, but doing things that people ask questions. It's all about questions. Now, some things we've gotten used to doing. But I still remember there was a rabbi in Elizabeth, New Jersey named Rabbi Teitz. And for karpas, when you dip in salt water, he would use a banana. So why would he use a banana? So first off, if you saw someone dipping a banana in salt water, what would you ask? Why using a banana? At the same time, he did it to prove a point that the banana is hadama. you say the blessing over the banana is the same blessing over celery, the same blessing over parsley. He wanted to show the point that the banana is a hadam, because most people say banana is a fruit. So he wanted to show that banana may be a fruit, but has the blessing of a vegetable. But it's still very engaging. So you have this idea of an Afikoman. You have the idea of the Afikoman being set aside. You have the idea of Afikoman being put in a cover. You have the idea of the Afikoman being matzah being snatched to get children to ask questions. Over time, this developed into different practices for the Afikoman and the like. So you also have the development of the idea that the Afikoman has symbolism on its own. So there's a law in the Code of Jewish Law, this is source 8, that would seem to be coming out of left field, but is invoked with regards to the Afikoman. It's prohibited to pierce a hole in meat so that it can be suspended, but by hand it is permitted. If the intent is to mark the meat, it is permitted even with a knife. So the idea, it has to do with what you're allowed to do on a holiday and what's considered too commercial, that it's too much like business. Because the Magen Avraham says, because you have to show that this is not about, you're not marking the meat to sell it. So it's talked about, if you want to suspend it, you can make a hole in it to hang it up to dry or something like that. But you don't want to mark it with a knife that you might sell it. Okay, leaving aside selling it, not selling it, and the like, but this idea of making a hole that you're going to hang it, the Magen Avraham says, since you're allowed to make a hole, you're allowed to hang it, you're allowed to work with the meat, as long as it's not for selling it, because you're not allowed to do business on Yom Tov. Mutter linko chatichas afikomen bepesach litlosa. You're allowed to make a hole in the matzah of the afikomen so you can hang the afikomen up. Now, why would you be hanging the afikomen up? So that's what Rabbi Yaakov Rasher wants to know. Because he said, someone asked me, what are you doing hanging up the Afikoman? He says, I don't have any idea. I don't know. Now, I have heard that you shouldn't do this because it's, remember, what did we say before about what does the Afikoman represent? It represents the holiest part of the Passover Seder. It represents the Karban Pesach. He says, if it's really supposed to be that, then what are you doing disgracing it by making a hole in it and hanging it up? But it does seem like people were doing it, and therefore, if people were doing it, if Jews were doing it, then it must be an okay practice. But the Rabbi Yaakov Rasher also wants to know what's going on. Rav Sternbuch talks about this as well. Remember, he was the one who talked about that the kids shouldn't watch it. He says that it could be that the Tlias Ha'afikomen Kol Shanan B'Vayis Yisgula Neged Geneva. It's a segula. If we're supposed to protect the Afikoman, then it's kind of like it's like a safety security system. The Afikoman represents protection, so let's hang it up in our homes as a sign of protection. Right? You might want to put, protected by alert security. No, hang up the Afikoman. We're protected. So that's maybe how it developed. The idea of holding on to it, that it developed as being something special. Now, Rabbi Chaim Vital, who was the student of Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Kabbalist, he says that lishtok hayam mizafo kizayis matzah shmur min afikomin tashlich lidal ruchos hasfina. He says if there's a storm on a ship and you want to quiet the winds, if you want to be saved, you take a piece of the afikomin and you throw it overboard. You throw it in each direction and you'll silence the wind. The yishkot miyad. Now, we have a record of Sir Moses Montefiore. Sir Moses Montefiore, the great British philanthropist and supporter of Israel and the windmill in Israel and everything like that. So if you investigate, they publish a lot of his diaries and they've written a lot about him. And it is found in his diaries, and this you see in source 13, that Monday evening, the 26th of November, 1827, aboard the Leonidas, Captain John Anderson, 60 miles southeast of Malta. This passage has been passed through the different generations. Moses Montefiore had no children. He has a family, and there's an extended family and their descendants. There's a tradition to read this entry about this story every Passover. Since Friday last, we encountered continual gales of wind with a heavy sea. Our ship, leaky the pumps, being constantly at work. The gale of yesterday was allowed by the oldest seaman aboard to have been horrific, attended by a most dangerous short sea moving mountains high. At 10 o'clock, the wind began to abate. After midnight, the sea became less agitated. This morning, the sky again reformed its most threatening aspect. Dawn clouds rising in all directions. Captain and seaman foretelling a repetition of the late dreadful weather. At this awful pause a little before noon, I threw into the sea a small piece of last year's Passover cake, laid by on the evening of the Haggadah, supplicating the Almighty to protect us and to avert the coming tempest, likewise to tranquilize the still troubled ocean. So you have a tradition of the Afikoman, a tradition of the Afikoman protecting people, Shmura Matzah in general, and the idea of the Afikoman Kabbalistically, symbolically being able to calm the sea. And this is something that even Moses Montefiore was aware of and did so himself. Go figure. So there are people who save a piece of the Afikoman and they hold on to it. And like I said before, sometimes if you open up an Afikoman bag on Pesach, you'll find crumbs from last year's or the year before, the year before. And I think in the Packin family, they had the Joe Packin's father escaped the Shoah, escaped the Holocaust, and he was able to bring with him his siddur, his tefillin, and pieces of matzah that he baked in 42, 43, and 44 very famously. And they've spoken about this, and there's pictures of it in the Holocaust book that Sue Talansky wrote about Atlantic Beach. And they have the matzah. And I wonder what it tastes like. You know, people wonder, Yashan Ma'od. Matzah, you sometimes wonder, does it taste worse a year later? Like, how many of us have matzah from last year? I don't know if I want to try matzah from 1942. Although, as you know, I'm a very big Seinfeld fan. And there's a Seinfeld episode where Jay Peterman wants to buy cake from the wedding of the one who abdicated the throne from 1936. And so, I don't know. I'm sure matzah holds up better than buttercream frosted wedding cake. But
you put it in the oven again, even if it's last year.
Yeah, you let me know how that works out for you. I don't know. Someone told me today they're getting matzah that's going to be baked fresh a week before Pesach. I'm like, really? Is it that much better? There was a tradition that some had. They would bake matzah on Erev Pesach. They call it matzah's mitzvah. And Hasidim do it, and sometimes they have. There was a tradition that they would bake matzah Leil HaSeder that night. And it's very dangerous because all the chametz possibilities and the like. But I wonder, just like fresh hot matzah doesn't sound the same as fresh hot bagel. It just doesn't. All right, but so we have matzah. We have this Afikoman ritual, and this Afikoman ritual seems to be something that was part at the end of a meal that maybe led the meal to go in a different direction. And the Mishnah says, don't let it happen. And instead we have an Afikoman that's a dessert, that's a final taste that seems to incorporate a message or a remnant or a reminiscence or a recollection of the Passover offering. And if it's remembering that, then it makes sense how the custom developed to wrap it and hold it and keep it safe. And if we're talking about how we want to excite the children by snatching and moving around matzah, maybe that's how the kids started getting involved. And if we want to talk about the kids getting involved and taking and holding it, well, then maybe we also have different symbolism of the matzah with regards to holding on to it and representing something spiritual and spiritually powerful, so much so that practice went on to even one that was understood by Moses Montefiore. Now, in terms of the symbolism, in terms of at the end of the Seder, for those that are involved in the children holding the Afikoman and holding it ransom, right? That's another way to keep the kids awake. If they can hold it ransom and get a gift, right? There's an Afikoman present. There's a negotiation, and some of the rabbis who were aware of this custom don't like this because that does is feed into Jewish stereotypes of greedy Jewish merchants holding out for high prices and the like. It just, also, you can make a deal. You can't make a deal on Yontif. We just say you can't do business. We would call this pasnish. It's not appropriate. But this idea, it certainly keeps people up to the end. I always remember my father's opening bid would be a kiss, and it would always be rejected because, come on, a father's kiss. That's you want a baseball glove or an action figure, but so sometimes you can imagine. Well, let's say the kid gets greedy and doesn't want to give it back. So I often point out that Rabbi Moshe Isserlis from Krakow, Source 15, points out if the Afikoman is lost, you can eat another piece of matzah. So that was always, that's like the nuclear option, right? We're going to get rid of the filibuster. So we're going to, I don't need your Afikoman. I'll eat another piece of matzah. But this idea of what the Afikoman represents in terms of the memories of the Seder is captured very nicely and poignantly by an author, Mike Ingen. It's a story called Alvin and the Afikoman, which I found on Chabad.org. And he says the story is basically Alvin has the Afikoman, he doesn't want to give it back. And he's fighting it, he doesn't want to give it back. Everyone's like, we want to go, you want to keep going. The story is very cute. It says, no, I declare this to be the new Afikoman. We're not going to wait for your Afikoman. And they would understand, Alvin, what's the big deal? Give up the matzah. So Alvin says, pretty soon we'll go our separate ways. This gathering, this tradition will be just a memory. So I was thinking, what if the Afikoman wasn't found? It would be the endless Seder. Bubby would keep cooking her delicious meals. We could stay here forever. One big happy family. Very cute. Dad sat down next to his son. It's a noble idea, Alvi. But think about it. The Seder doesn't end. We would miss Shabbat. Not to mention Hanukkah and your bar mitzvah. Sometimes we wish time would stand still, that things could always be just as they are. But without the changing of the seasons, life itself cannot exist. There would be no sunrise, no dawning of a new day with its promises and mysteries. Who knows? Next year, we could all be in Israel, eating dishes you've never tasted, celebrating with cousins you've never met. Alvin smiled for the first time all evening. Next year in Jerusalem, he said to his father. Yes, Alvin, next year in Jerusalem. The Seder has to end. All good things come to an end. But the passage of time and moving forward is essential for growth, for moving forward, for the future. And that too is part of what the Afikoman represents. It's a exclamation point on the Seder experience and everything that the Seder contains within it. And it has a little bit of study and learning and questions and answers. And it's about the children. It's about symbolism. It's about spirituality. It's about all of these things. And then Rabbi Aaron Goldscheider explains, they talk about the last thing to end where we started. The Mishnah in Psachim, which says the last, don't conclude with the Afikoman, or Ein Maftirin Achar Pesach Afikoman. The idea is also understood that you're not supposed to eat after the Afikoman. The Afikoman is the last thing you eat. You have some more wine, but it's the last thing you eat. Now, many of us are thinking, how much more can you eat? Right? You ate a lot of matzah, you ate vegetables, you ate a dinner, right? How much more are you going to eat? But Rabbi Aaron Goldscheider quotes this idea that the last piece of matzah of the night has to be the last taste we have so that the Seder accompanies us throughout the coming year. On Seder night, God has given us freedom, holiness, joy, and wholeness. It's our job to hold on to them in the months to come. Everyone thinks that at the end of the Seder, it's all over. They're so mistaken. It's after the Seder that it all begins. So with the Afikoman, we've had our fill of all that the Seder represents so that we can take it forward and to move on with the Shabbos and the holidays and next year in Jerusalem and the future of the Jewish people. It's like the story I always like to say about the individual who ended up at one of the services of the Christian Shakers. And it was a silent service. And he's sitting there and everyone's sitting there quietly. And he says to one of the ushers, he's like, so when does the service begin? And the guy said, the service begins once we go outside. We have to have that continuation. And so that's what the Afikoman also represents. So whether you're hiding it, stealing it, eating it, hopefully not losing it, and most importantly, enjoying it and sharing it with family and friends, the Afikoman is chock full of, if not nutrients, the ingredients of Jewish celebration and Jewish continuity. For all of us, a very happy Pesach. And for all of us, I think it's appropriate to hope and pray, L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, with the hostages home, with more peace for all of our people. Amen.
Mentioned about the Christian, just remind me, someone said, he asked me, why did they fire the Christian from the ice cream store?
Mm-hmm.
He didn't want to work on Sundays.
Is anybody aware that Afikoman is a Greek word?
Sunday.
All of us are. That's what we said at the very beginning.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's
I
okay.
missed that. Okay. It literally means putting it away, putting it aside for later.
Right. So that's what Saul Lieberman said. The idea of Afikoman was part of this idea of everyone going their own way. And what they were hoping to do is that they didn't want the Jews to all get up and go to someone else, go somewhere else after the Seder.
Okay. Enjoy.
All right.
Moadim lesimcha. Hagim
Same.
uzmanim lesason.
Amen, amen for everybody. And a good Pesach. And again, tomorrow night, Shir with Rabbi Lefkowitz and Rabbi Krohn.
Oh, we are having it tomorrow?
Yes.
A schedule?
And
Yeah.
regular schedule, Shir on the regular schedule.
Okay.
All right?
Double the pleasure.
That's the way we roll. All right, take care. Be well.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.